I'm Chris Bajorquez, and on behalf of my colleagues here at Invariant, I'm pleased to welcome you to our fifth Dialogue for Change. Dialogue for Change is Invariant's series focusing on critical conversations about racial injustice and inequality, and the actions that we can take to influence change in the public and private sectors. Today, our distinguished moderator and speakers will approach diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI, from the point of view of the Latinx community. As a first-generation American and the son of Honduran and Colombian immigrants, this conversation is deeply personal for me. DEI initiatives in corporate America can open doors for individuals like myself to provide a much-needed perspective on the largest growing minority population in the United States. I am hopeful that this dialogue will continue to shed light on the need for and the benefits of increased professional advancement for Latinx employees. Thank you to our guest moderator, Hector Sanchez, and the panelists, Claudia Romo Edelman, Patricia Tames, and Sid Wilson for joining us. In appreciation for their participation, Invariant will be making contributions to the charities of their choice: the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, We Are All Human, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, and Mi Familia Vota. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Hector Sanchez, who is the Executive Director and CEO of Mi Familia Vota. He's also a Senior Fellow at the George Washington University Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute and the Chair Emeritus of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. And our panelists, Claudia Romo Edelman, who is the founder of the We Are All Human Foundation, a New York-based nonprofit foundation dedicated to advancing the agenda of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Patricia Tames is a government relations advisor at the Shell Oil Company, who has more than a decade of Capitol Hill experience, including as executive director of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And Sid Wilson, who is the president and chief executive officer of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. His leadership in the corporate sector includes previous service on the Ethnic Advisory Board for PepsiCo and the Consumer Advisory Board for Verizon Communications. I'd now like to turn it over to our panel moderator, Hector Sanchez, to begin our conversation. Hector?
Thank you, and I want to thank all of our friends and at Invariant for the invitation and for putting this conversation together. We're facing such an interesting historical times for the nation, for our democracy, but at the same time for the Latino and the immigrant community. And these kind of conversations are very important and are critical to have a structural and a strategic approach to the way we work with the Latino community and how do we move forward. But more importantly, from the opportunities point of view. The Latino community, we're almost 20% of the population. We are a central block deciding the future of this nation from the civic participation point of view, from the economic point of view. The investment of the Latino community is very critical. We are the youngest community in the nation. We're almost 10 years younger than the national average. So these kind of conversations are so critical, not only to look at the problems that we have of underrepresentation of Latinos in the most important spaces of power in the nation, but also to look at opportunities. And when we talk about these opportunities in the context of corporate America, is unique, and we have a number of amazing people in this conversation that are going to share some of those different elements. I'm the CEO of Mi Familia Vota. We are a national Latino organization that the top priority is to promote civic participation and build Latino power in the nation. We do voter registration, GOTV, voter education, census, and national mobilizations around these important issues. We have a very important element of non-partisan 501c3 efforts, but we have a very robust and the most aggressive C4 campaign in the history of the Latino community in our nation that is called Basta Trump. Obviously, the name is very clear and specific of why we're doing this campaign, to put an end to the nightmare of attacks that we have seen from this White House in particular, not only exclusion of every policy issue, but just contacts as attacks and promotion of hate and violence against our community. I contextualize this, even though this is a 501c3 and non-partisan conversation, just to really understand how all these different elements, the politics, really affect what is happening in our community and also in corporate America. That's why I wanted to contextualize this important element. I used to be the chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. I'm the chair emeritus at this moment. That is the space where we have 46 national Latino organizations. where they come together to create the public policy agenda of the community. That's the agenda that is presented to Congress, to the president, to all the presidents in the past 25 years, with the exception of the one that we have in the White House right now. The White House has been literally shut down for Latino leadership and organizations in the last 4 years. But I mentioned NHLA because 3 years ago, we created a campaign called Latino Power Project. And the goal of this project was to really understand why, on the one hand, we were facing so many challenges on the policy issues, and in the other hand, the challenges and the structural exclusion of Latinos from the most important spaces of power in the nation. And the conclusion of this campaign, and it comes with a lot of research, is that Latinos we are the group that is the most excluded from the most important centers of power in the nation. From Capitol Hill to the Senate, Congress, at the federal level, the state level, local level, from the corporate world, that is the conversation that we're going to have today, the lowest numbers of seats in corporate spaces, in C-suites, etc. That's the general context. So the central question that I would like to pose for this conversation is, why do we have this issue? Why do we have this structural problem of exclusion of Latinos from these important spaces, even though we know in research shows that we have some of the best and most qualified Latinas and Latinos to be able to perform these jobs? And the other one that I mentioned at the beginning is opportunities. So with that, and with that context in the background, we're going to have this conversation with the amazing panelists that were already introduced. And we decided not to do the big bios because we could take the whole hour just describing the amazing work that our great friends have done in the past, and just focus on the questions, and they can tell a little bit about the work that they do. So let me start with our good friend, Claudia Romo Edelman. Claudia, you have done some interesting and amazing work trying to bring infrastructures together to advance common agendas. But there is an interesting element that is happening right now in the nation, and it's the amazing movement of Black Lives Matter, which is a cry for respect, it's a cry for inclusion, it's a cry for diversity. And we see a lot of elements that really relate to the Latino community from many elements, not only the particular issue of criminal justice issues, but just national mobilizations to try to make us a better democracy. How do you see that all the national movement that is taking place right now aligns with a lot of the movements that we have seen in the Latino community related to immigration, and also to contextualize the concept that we openly discuss about corporate America? Claudia?
First of all, let me say thank you. Gracias for the opportunity of being in this panel and the opportunity to speak up. And I have a message, which has been the same message that I've been saying again and again, which is unification is the key. For our community, it will mean actually the way to step forward and break through so many barriers. But also historically, if you look around how big revolutions and big movements historically have happened, it is pretty much the same way. You need a bunch of people, like not more than 50 people, that believe in the same dream, that have the same goal, and they push forward. And when I was working, I was fortunate enough to be working my entire life for global organizations like the United Nations, UNICEF, the World Economic Forum, and else. And when the last job I had, I was sitting on the executive office of the Secretary General. And from that perspective, from the 38th floor of the United Nations, you have access to all the data at the macro level, looking at everything. And if I started looking at everything, of all the data, of all the countries, of every single aspect, the world's getting better. There is progress around the world. Even if we're bombarded by negative news, if you look at all the macro levels, if you would be a baby girl flying in the sky, there would be no better time to be born than today. There is no better time, not in the caves, not in Middle Age, not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, but today for us to have access to health, to education, to voting, to electricity, to a chance to choose what you do. And and despite that, there were a couple of things that really were concerning to me, and they were against the trends. And one of them is that divisive language was getting traction. And that could really hinder the progress that we're making as a humanity. That, the sense of the belief that there's an otherness that is different than you, that doesn't believe like what you are, and that's scary, that sense of we don't belong to the same human family is dangerous. It is dangerous. It creates populism, it creates Brexits, it creates George Floyd's as we see it. So 3 years ago, I created World Human, because precisely that I needed to make sure that I could use my platform to remind people that we belong to the same human family. That if there would be something like COVID coming, it would make no distinction whether you were white or black, whether you were one party, political party or the other, because we belong to the same human family, and what happens to one happens to the other. So we're intrinsically connected. And we forget that, mainly for a number of reasons, but algorithms feed you with the things that you want to hear. You're only evident with the things you have. You live in your bubble. But it is very, very important that we understand that we belong to the same human family. And Black Lives Matters and the death of George Floyd allowed for that conversation about race, about social justice to come up, and to make sure that we open the social consciousness, the collective consciousness of people to start understanding, getting into it, looking at the data. Like Janet Murguia said, our solidarity with Black Americans is rooted in the shared structural inequities that impact both our communities. We Latinos, we've also been facing racism, discrimination in this country. From 850 to 1900, our lands were taken. We were lynched along with our African-American brothers and sisters. We were called greasers, as we were not part of like us. We were not the same quality of humans. We did not have access to education. We did not have access to schooling. And yet, as John Leguizamo said, despite being hit so badly, Latinos were here, we're still writing, we're still dancing, we're still inventing, and we need the heroes. We need to recognize that we're 26 different countries of origins, that we're Cesar Chavez, we're Sonia Sotomayor, we're the Mayans that invented the zero. We have so much to be proud, and we need to be proud. And this Hispanic Heritage Month, that's why I'm urging everyone to use this opportunity to go and showcase the incredible contributions of our community to this country since the 16th century, to showcase, but also to reflect ourselves on our heritage, to be educated about how much we have contributed in so many different industries. We absolutely need to be proud so that we can be loud. And the way that those social movements have taught us is historically, is that we have to be united, educated, and proud in order to be able to move forward the conversation for an entire community.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Sid, you're Dominicano, and I know how proud you are of being a Dominicano. I've seen you organizing around the Dominican community, in the Latino community, the immigrant community. But there is an important element about Latinos of African descent in the Latino community, which is an important conversation. How do you perceive the Black Lives Matter movement and the connection that we have to this important effort?
Well, first, let me start by saying, buenas tardes, mi gente. And Hector, thank you so much for moderating and for your many years of leadership when you chaired the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. And thank you for your leadership in helping us to register to vote under your leadership with Mi Familia Vota. It's great to be among many colleagues, and to Patricia, my good friend, who we are U.S. Spain Council Young Leaders. Maybe not so young anymore, at least me not so young anymore. Patricia, you're still very, and great. And of course to my dear friend Claudia Romo Edelman, who's been a great partner as we've opened the doors of the World Economic Forum in Davos to Latinos, and partnering with her with the Hispanic Promise, and of course to and Chris Bohorquez, and everyone at Invariant. Thank you so much for your leadership. I appreciate the question because as you can imagine, what's happened this year is an opportunity for us to reflect as Latinos and the diversity within our own Latino community. On a typical year, I might do maybe one Afro-Latino webinar per year within corporate America. This year, I've already done 30. And I think part of that reason has been the reflection that what has been happening within the Black community has an impact within our community, in particular for Afro-Latinos. For me as an Afro-Latino, I recognize that the issues that impact us don't get talked about enough and needs to be discussed more frequently. Being involved in the Dominican community, a country that is 90% Black or have African ancestry, and recognizing our histories, including the histories that we're not proud of as Latinos, and the history of slavery, the history of racism, the history of oppression that happens throughout Latin America, and very similar to what has happened here in the U.S. with the Black community, is why we have to recognize that we are stronger together, and we must be a fully inclusive community, and not only be champions for Hispanic inclusion, but we also must be strong collaborators and look for those allies that we can turn allies into what I call diversity accomplices, meaning that it's not that you just support inclusion, it's that you're a champion of inclusion. So one of the things that I do as an Afro-Latino is I let people know the fact that that I don't distinguish between my proud Latino heritage with my proud Blackness. And the fact that Black lives matters, because while I'm in my ASER position with my ASER logo, and of course wearing, dressed nicely, when I go out for a jog and I have a t-shirt and shorts and sneakers and I'm jogging around in the community, I'm Black in America. When I'm casual and I'm driving my car, I'm driving while Black. And with that comes all the challenges that happen that relate to racism in America. And so we must stand together. We must lock arms together. We must say, we shall overcome and si se puede together. When we do all those things, then we will see that together we can all make an impactful difference to make our country a more perfect union. And so that's why I'm looking forward to this conversation with you and all of my esteemed colleagues on this panel. But thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Sid, and thank you for all the amazing work that you do in the community. Patricia, we have done some work in Congress advancing Latino priorities and issues when you were at CHCI. Something that is very interesting is the amazing diversity and the tapestry of the Latino and the immigrant community. And that's something we should be, and we are extremely proud of. But it's important that the general public understands that richness, that diversity. In particular, in the context of corporate America, what would you like to share related to diversity and inclusion in the context of our diversity, and how much more we bring to the table to empower corporations to be better and be more competitive?
Well, thank you, Hector, for the question. And also, I'd like to echo the comments of my fellow panelists and thanking Invariant for putting together this conversation. We're at the midway point of Hispanic Heritage Month, so it's a good time for all of us to reflect on the diversity in the Latino community and all that we bring. And it's a really valuable question because I, as someone who grew up on the US-Mexico border, did not appreciate the diversity of our community until I moved to Washington, D.C. And there is a recent study by the Society for Human Resource Management and CHCI, the Hispanic Caucus Institute, that noted that the majority of Hispanic and Latinos actually prefer to identify with their family's country of origin. Only 24% self-identify as Hispanic or Latino, which means most people are likely to answer Mexican, Colombian, Cuban, Honduran, Ecuadorian, all of the different communities that we are a part of. And so what I think that first step is acknowledging that there's much diversity within our own community and that it's valuable. And so not to speak from just one vantage point or to make an assumption that all are Mexicans or all are Cubans or all are Puerto Ricans, but really to value the diverse history and richness that your employees bring to your company. The one important piece is that no one is going to accept the notion that talent doesn't exist. And it's unfortunately, we're still at that point where we hear CEOs of major companies saying, well, the talent's just not there. And so companies really need to expand their recruiting and acknowledge that Latinos are overrepresented in our nation's universities today. They're getting educated. We're younger, very driven community. And so expand your recruiting to those universities who have excelled in their own recruiting, in their own diversity efforts. Some of them are Hispanic serving institutions, others are not. We also, in terms of retention, I am the first person in my family to work in a corporation. It's not something I ever thought I'd actually do, but it's something I've really enjoyed doing. But so I would focus on the important word of inclusion. And recently our own CEO made the comment that diversity is measured and inclusion is hard, because it's hard to measure that. And so companies have to really work towards making sure that you are being inclusive, even if your community is diverse. And Harvard Business School really did a study on that, on how even in diverse corporations, many minorities still feel excluded. And so I would just that's something for me that's been valuable is our mentorship programs, and making sure that you're mentoring and you're really focusing on first generation, maybe people who are just come from areas that are not your typical employee base, and really focus on mentorship. And the other thing is to utilize those Latino employee networks. But one thing I would caution is don't just go to them on issues of diversity. Don't just go to them on issues of immigration. Go to them on the issues that are impacting your company on a day-to-day basis, because we have valuable insights, and the perspective that we bring is a good thing for companies to be measuring, given the size of our population, and given for corporations the fact that our community tends to really value those relationships and has really strong attachment to products, to ideas, to things where we feel that our perspective is brought into the conversation.
Muchas gracias, Patricia. Claudia, going back to you. What kind of outreach and policy changes do corporations need to do in order to attract Latinas and Latinos for promotions, for retention, for structural changes at the highest levels? What are some of your recommendations, Claudia?
I mean, Sid Wilson is the expert of this. I mean, I stand on his shoulders, and his organization is the one that is really going to the heart of organizations. What he and I did together that I think is very valuable. And again, like I was raised and born a marketer my entire life, so I see life through that angle. And I started looking at, when I was moving to America 5 years ago, I never heard the term Hispanic before in my life. I lived my entire life as a happy Mexican, 25 years in Europe, and then I came to the country and I was like, what is this? Hispanic is a great term, and what does it mean? And I started looking at the numbers, and I started looking at how many we are, how powerful we are, how young we are, how big is our wallet, and how we have a huge reality and a very different perception. So for me, that's a reverse marketing problem, and whomever was doing the marketing for the Hispanic community was doing everything possible to hide our attributes and to present us as someone we're not. And I came to see it after seeing the incredible work that he does within corporations. And I was like, let's actually put something together. And together we decided to create the Hispanic Star, the Hispanic Promise, which is a first of a kind corporate pledge for companies to be able to make a promise to us, to our community, to hire, promote, retain, and celebrate Hispanics. And to be able to also have employees use this as a way to understand that you don't have to be a destination. You can be in the journey, but as long as I know you're showing leg where you're Hispanic friendly, you want to share best practices, you want to learn lessons learned with other organizations, I know that you made me a promise. So we went to the World Economic Forum, as Sid mentioned just before, because this is something that our agenda has to be top of the mind of the leaders of corporations. ERGs, employee resource groups, business resource groups are doing an incredible work. But we need to help those ERGs that have been putting the agenda just to make the sandwich or the taco go down, and make sure that the CEOs have learned that. And when we launched that a year and a half ago, we had a panel say, like, we're launching the Hispanic Promise. This is our first corporate pledge. to hire, promote, retain, and celebrate Hispanics. Those are the channels. Those are the issues that are behind that. And we have more than 160 companies that have signed to date. And we're not alone. I mean, Seed obviously is the leader, but beyond that, behind this promise, there are 30 Hispanic organizations, because that's what we need. We need every one of us as the Hispanic community and Hispanic associations pushing for a number of things together. And we need corporate America to come and sit at the table and say, okay, we're discussing, all of you with all of us, so that we can have a dialogue. And I think that there are things that are absolutely distinctive in the work that I am new to this, but some of the things that I have learned in this time is that it is important to be curious about who we are as Latinos. We are massive, but we're also our values. We're hardworking, we're aspirational, we're fighters, we are family and friends. And at the workplace, that's who we are. We come with a t-shirt that already comes with an emotional engagement. We come with that sense of hardworking, and 8 in every 10 Hispanics has hardworking at the top of their head as a value. So we come with that, but we also have our issues. So you need 3 Latinos in a room, in a corporate room, so that they feel comfortable to speak up. You need 2 women, you need 3 Latinos. Damian Rivera, the president of Alpha, shared with me a story that I will never forget. He told me that when he was in a consulting firm in Accenture, his boss said, like, look, I really would like to promote you, but it's very hard because your colleagues feel that you're arrogant and you think that their ideas are bad. And Damian said, like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? Yeah, because every time they speak in a meeting, you look at the floor as opposed to look at them in the eye. And Damian said, like, oh, no, absolutely not. It's not that I disrespect them. It's not that I don't think their ideas are good. It's that I grew up in the Bronx, and when you look at people in the eyes, they actually think that you're picking a fight with them, and I don't want to fight with any one of my colleagues. And if the boss of Damian wouldn't have the curiosity to go and ask him, what is it that you're doing that is actually seen differently? What is it that I need to understand as your manager, to be able to bring the best of you, to be able to showcase who you are, understand your hardworking, understand your commitment to the organization. But I know you don't bark, I know you don't bite, I know you don't slam the table. So how do I help you to be able to contribute to this organization, bringing your best self, staying in the company because you're not gonna feel that you cannot be yourself, and then stay. So I think that that's where I see it is very important that we have this promise as a tool that allows for companies to discuss and allows people to start sharing best practices about who we are as a Latino community, and what are the things that are important for us to know about ourselves, but also for managers and allies to understand and support our community in the workplace.
Gracias, Claudia. Sid, going back to you. In my opening statement, I was talking about the structural exclusion of Latinos in the corporate boards and the C-suites. Which is a very big problem in the nation, historically. I can tell you how many times in the most important spaces of power, from presidents to cabinet members to CEOs, they claim that they can find talented people in our community. And when we look at the research, we know that at the highest levels, it can be in politics or it can be in the corporate boards. One of the biggest problems that we have is nepotism. So it's not really about the fact that we cannot find the best and the brightest. So let me read a couple of statistics. Sid, you are the expert on this, but just to contextualize the question. Hispanics represent 4% of corporate executives, but 15% of the labor force. Hispanics hold 7% of corporate board seats. 1.21% of executives are Latina, and 22.29% of corporate board members are Latinas. So this is unacceptable, especially when we're almost 20% of the population. What needs to happen, Sid? And more importantly, what is the opportunity that corporations are missing of having diversity in their boards and at the highest levels?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question, because this is something that we need to continually hold corporate America accountable when it comes to Hispanic, Latino inclusion at all levels of the company, from the board of directors to the C-suite, to the senior managers, to the mid-level managers, all the way to the front line, even the recruits that come in after they graduate college, or if they come from a trade and come into the workforce. The reality is that if I were to name you a country, and I want to describe this country, and you're corporate America, and I say, would you expand into this country that is the 8th largest economy in the world, that is dollar denominated, that is AAA rated, in terms of bond rating, that has a strong regulatory structure, that is growing in population faster than most developed countries, and that is growing stronger economically than all others? Would you invest in a country like that? They will say, of course. Well, I just described to you the US Latino community here in the US. I mean, that's how powerful we are globally. And yet, despite that, you know, to hear things like, we can't find enough Latino talent, or we're having a hard time finding someone that could be quote unquote a fit. Careful when someone says this person is not quote a fit, because that is, to me, code word for this is not an assimilated person. This is someone that hasn't assimilated to a very white-centric view of how corporate America works. And so I share with corporate America that it is not our obligation to assimilate to you. It is your job to acculturate to us. We are the growing community. We are the ones with the economic power. We are the ones with the talent that will take your company to a competitive edge compared to your competitors. We are the present, we are the future, and it must be reflected at all levels of your company, including your board of directors. The fact of the matter is, with boards, you know, I got on my first board when I was only 36 years old, and that's about 20 years earlier than the average person that gets on their first board seat, which is about 58. But I got there because it all started with an ally, an accomplice, someone, he was white Caucasian, discovered me when I was in the mailroom at a Wall Street investment firm. I was a mail boy, you know, delivering mail in the office, but because I took a liking of the industry and this person liked my math, he literally said, I'm going to take you out of the mailroom and I am going to mentor you and I'm going to be your sponsor. And through that power of sponsorship, I went from the mailroom to an assistant to an associate to junior analyst to senior analyst to vice president and managing director and director of research. And then in 2006, Forbes came with a ranking of their best Wall Street analysts and ranked me #1. I say that not because I'm here to impress you. I'm saying this because this person made a very intentional decision to find qualified Latinos that can do the job. And if you stretch their skills to learn those new leadership skills, we can rise up. And so I'm no different than anyone else. The difference is I had a mentor and surrounded by other leaders who believed that it was important that we have intentional leadership. I want to remember this equation, Hector, and for everyone that's listening. You know, if you take D times I squared, D means diversity, I for inclusion, but the other I is intentionality. Because if you don't have intentionality with diversity and inclusion, you have nothing but words, nothing but an idea. Intentionality is the action equation that when you multiply it is where you make a big difference when it comes to moving the needle, when it comes to corporate boards. That's why, as I said, we buy shares. We're actually shareholders in hundreds of companies, so that gives us access to annual shareholder meetings where we can hold companies accountable when it comes to their boards. I praise what Governor Gavin Newsom in California did yesterday, signing a bill into law that mandates that California-based companies have at least one board member that is racially or ethnically diverse. because 73% of Fortune 1000 companies have not one single Latino on their board of directors. That is absolutely unacceptable in the year 2020. And that's why together, working with all of our colleagues and working with our SID coalition members and our team and our allies and our partners, not only within the Latino community, but all of our diversity partners, our Alliance for Board Diversity partners, the Executive Leadership Council, Catalyst, LEAP, and many others, that we can push the needle on this, because we know that companies that include diversity and inclusion as part of their business structure from the board of directors to the C-suite will outperform their competitors who do not. But we must continue to do that, and we must continue to end that practice of asking, who do I know? Who do you know? And if you're asking people that aren't in diverse communities, who do they know? Of course they're gonna come back and say, I don't know anybody. So stop with the who do I know, be intentional on increasing diversity and inclusion on those corporate boards and in the C-suite and strong pipelines. And if we do that, you will see that we will create a much more perfect corporate America.
Gracias, Sid. And going back to you, Claudia, around the same lines, the Black Corporate Directors Conference has a call to action for DEI, focuses on the 3 Ps that we heard, people, purchasing, and philanthropy. What kind of investments can companies make in the Latinx community that can help with the recruiting and also with the expansion of Latinx entrepreneurship?
Hector, I am somehow, and I was even more before, I was very jealous and admire of how many lessons we can learn from other communities, from the African American community, not only their unification, but also having a strategic plan and having somehow the, like a paper where we can be all singing from the same song sheet and understanding what kind of jobs they wanted and what areas they were going to push for and so on. So I just like on that vein, a couple of years ago, Sid was one of the co-chairs of a summit that we did at the United Nations, the first time in which we tried to bring together every single Hispanic leader just to talk about like what unites us, what's our agenda, what are the things that we care for. And we had voting mechanisms, and in that space, people voted for an agenda for Hispanics that was composed of 3 things. The first one was education. Education in the form of internships, apprenticeships, scholarships, mentorships, particularly important, and we have seen it now in a time of COVID, where you absolutely need to have education in those, particularly in those sectors that now are clearly strategic: tech, healthcare, financial. The number 2 agenda point was financial empowerment, and that was voted across, and that has been corroborated with all the research across the Latino priorities, that education and financial empowerment matter and are important for the breakthrough of our community. And financial empowerment in terms of entrepreneurship is massive, because we need access to capital. 86% of every single job in America since the Great Recession has been created by a Latino, and 50% by a Latina. Latinas create small businesses 6 times faster than any other group in America, but we don't scale. We remain in 2 to 3 employees. We need to make sure that we have access to capital, that we have financial literacy so that we know how to talk to a bank, how to ask for credit. We need to break through that number of the 3% of all our entrepreneurs that barely manage to make it for more than $1 million in revenue. Only 3% of grant money goes to Latinos. And so we need to actually make sure that we understand we're entrepreneurs, and that's massive. So what strategically are the things that we need to be doing so that we can actually scale up, so that we can get into procurement and be part of the supply chain of those Fortune 500 companies that absolutely need to diversify their efforts, not only on employees, but also all across their chain, including supply chain. And the number 3, and I do want to mention, because this is part of like the focus of what we're doing, so education, financial empowerment, but also perception change. For the Latino community, being invisible is really hurting us. And so we have to do something about how are we going to change the perception of our community, because our reality is great. It is a perception that is really wrong. It is not that we don't have gaps and we don't have issues, but we have to push the needle from invisible to visible, from negative to positive, and from takers to makers. We need to make sure that people associate the Latino community, not with migration or with other stuff, we need to be associated with growth, with potential, with benefits to this country. And that is why that from those three priorities that people united came and voted for at the United Nations, the one thing that we as a foundation, the World Human Foundation, is acting upon and is not going to give up until we do it, is in perception change. And luckily, there's 1,000 people that are doing incredible individual efforts. And what we're trying to do is just bring them together using entrepreneurs as a great source of our story, because that's who we are. We need narrative tellers, we need storytellers, we need role models, and entrepreneurs are fantastic for that, bringing us all together. We went to a communications agency to treat this the way that you would treat any other brand, any other product. And we said, we have an issue of fragmentation and about awareness of our own contributions. And they came up with the idea that we need a symbol to unify us all. So we created the Hispanic Star as a way to showcase the contributions of Hispanics to the country, and recognizing that we're 100% Hispanics, but also 100% Americans. So the star for the American flag, the ñ for Espanol and Portuguese, that makes us a Hispanic Star. And it doesn't matter whether you're Mexican, Colombian, Puerto Rican, you can all be under one symbol. Think of the rainbow for the LGBTQ. But also it's a perception changer, because we need to be portrayed as that, as stars. America is made of stars, and Hispanics are one of them. And I think that owning our own story, owning our narrative, changing the perception for our community is something that all of us can do and can embark us. No matter where you are, everybody has a role to play, and entrepreneurs are integral in that part, so that we can be seen as that, entrepreneurs as stars.
Gracias, Claudia. Patricia, you are the past executive director of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Remember, we used to work together on a number of policy issues, but you guys were also pretty involved on this issue of diversity and inclusion in the corporate world. I remember having to get on the phone a number of times to respond to a number of issues, but also to advance agendas on this particular element. From your perspective and your time over there, how did you guys review company and measure company DEI programs at the time?
Well, one, a lot of it is in partnerships with the other Latino groups, and ASER is a really integral part of that. You know, Senator Menendez has done a lot of work on it itself and really started doing these surveys just to get a better sense of where the diversity numbers were. But really the most important thing was to develop a relationship. Sometimes, you know, people would come into you and they'd bring the one Latino that worked in their company, and they'd tell you all these things that they're going to do, but there was no real follow-up. And so for me, the most important part was to not hide your numbers. It is important to acknowledge where you are and where you want to go. And that's where the members would really hone in and develop that relationship and help you be successful. Because at the end of the day, I work in a corporation, right? So I know that there's a lot of oversight, and lawyers get involved, and everyone's worried about what's going to go into the press. The fact of the matter is, if you're interested and you really want to be held accountable, that's where working in the partnership with Hispanic Caucus and others is key, because they want to help you be successful. They want to make sure that you're successful in our communities, that you're going and talking to our communities, and that you're involving us in things, you know, that are not just your typical stuff. And I hone in on this because it was a constant. We would meet with media companies and we would look at their statistics, and most of the time, the only time they had a Latino contributor was on issues of immigration or issues of, you know, diversity. But you never had a Latino speaking on issues of financial importance or all the other issues that are important in our country that are being talked about. The only time you had a Latino on the panel or on the discussion was on immigration. And so that was something that we really pushed a lot on. Is one, immigration is a very important issue in our community, but it's not the only issue. And two is be a part of the solution and make sure that you are coming back to the caucus, that you have metrics, that you're hitting those metrics. Or if you're not hitting those metrics, being honest about it and saying, here's where we're challenged, what can we be doing better? And that ultimately, that's what the caucus wants to do, is they ultimately want to be partners. And I can count, in the 6 years I was the director of the Hispanic Caucus, I could count on one hand how many companies came back to us with those metrics and really involved the caucus and its members and its expertise in developing a plan. So for those of you who do government relations and want to establish a relationship with the CHCN, I'd say the same thing for the Congressional Black Caucus and the Asian Pacific American Caucus. I mean, we really do work in lockstep as one community and trying to help and elevate all of us at the same time. But it's more than just donating to their PAC. It's more than just donating to the organizations. It's really and truly showing up and being a part of the solution and helping drive accountability for your company.
Gracias, Patricia. Claudia, I know you have to leave soon. I just want to thank you. I don't know if you want to share maybe one or two things before you go. And then I have one more question for Sid before we open it up for a Q&A.
I want to say how honored I am to be sharing the stage with Patricia, Chris, and Sid. Thank you, Hector. These conversations matter. Let's use this Hispanic Heritage Month wisely. Let's not ever again allow us to have a 30-minute bad margarita to check the box of organizations saying, like, I've done my Hispanic Heritage Month and my Hispanics for the year, let's move on. Let's use this opportunity to remind ourselves that the time for Hispanics is now and that the time to act is today. Particularly after this year, people are going to be watching and looking at what are we doing, not only what are we saying. So thank you so much for what all you're doing, and thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel. And I'm so sorry I have to drop. Thank you.
Gracias, amiga. Estamos en contacto.
Thank you. Bye.
See, the final question before we open it up. How do we measure success and the implementation of goals to move in a positive direction?
Well, the first thing we have to do is make sure that as we are moving our community forward, it includes all of us, including Latinas. The reality is, and I'll just take a second on the Latinos component to this, is that, as I said, we, of course, we track research. We have our own in-house research too, where we track the number of Latinos on corporate boards and in the C-suites. We currently count that there are 16 Fortune 500 CEOs who are Latino or who are of Hispanic descent. Not one is Latina, not even one. We had one 2 years ago, but we currently have 0. And when you look at Latinas on corporate boards, it is at, ready for this, 0.8% of Fortune 500 board seats are held by Latinas. 0.8%. That's despite the fact that you hear about Latino economic buying power, $1.7 trillion. Did you know that 1.1 of that 1.7 is Latina economic buying power? 1.1 to 1.2, that's Latina economic buying power. Latina GDP is around 1.5, $1.7 trillion of Latina GDP. Latina-owned businesses are thriving. In fact, if Latinas were their own economy, Latinas would be the 11th largest economy in the world, would be a G20 country. And so as we move forward, we have to make sure that we are moving forward, we're being allies for each other and making sure that we rise up together, that we march together, that we sing together, that we protest together when we have to, and that we call for legislation. So for those that are in those positions of influence, where you can influence members of Congress to pass legislations that are pro-Latino, pro-equality, pro-inclusion, pro-social justice, that's going to help us to be able to make those differences. And then for those of us that are in these capacities where we have the audience of corporate America, to call for corporate America to be more inclusive, to call for more intentionality when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And when we do that, then together between our government relations brothers and sisters, as well as our corporate brothers and sisters, we can all do this together and effectuate change that will make us a better country and a better United States of America. But these are things that we have to do. But what we cannot do, if nothing else, you get nothing from this, what you cannot do is be silent and assume that someone else is going to solve this for you. no one is going to come to your rescue. We have to come together, and we must be the agents of change. Don't wait for someone else to do it for you. Together, we can all do this. And again, we shall overcome, and si se puede. And that's why I'm so proud of everyone that's in this panel. I'm proud of so many Latinos that are making a positive difference to move our community forward.
Gracias, Sid. And I want to thank Chris for helping us putting on organizing this together. But I can also see that Chris has a big fan club over here. I'm looking at the chat and everybody's like, Chris, 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 which I think it really goes to the point of we want to hear from young people. What is the view on diversity and inclusion? So Chris, I know we didn't put this in the agenda, but it will be amazing if you can speak maybe some ideas to how do you see this conversation and what are some of the recommendations that you have?
Sure. Thank you, Hector. And thank you to everyone, to Sid, Patricia, Claudia, for your very thoughtful comments. I think the aspect of this conversation that really touched me is the idea of people from our communities not necessarily having the infrastructure going into a professional environment, not having those connections, not knowing someone to get into the room. And so I'm lucky that I have been guided and allowed into the room by people who knew that it was important to have a Latino voice in the room. But I was really in the right place at the right time. And so I think going forward, for the C-suite, for the Government Affairs Office, it should be a structural priority and not necessarily just relying on staff members, leadership to kind of have the desire to bring in people of diverse communities, but have a structure in place where that is a priority for the company, for the government relations office. So very interesting and fascinating insight from everyone, and I appreciate everyone's thoughts.
If you want to send your question, we have a couple of minutes. I have one over here in the chat. Give me 1 second. And give me 1 second. So, trying to. All right. The question is: companies recruit from business schools. Should companies be doing something to ensure diversity in programs they recruit from? Okay, let me repeat it. Companies recruit from business school. Should companies be doing something to ensure diversity in programs they recruit from? Anyone?
Well, I'll take a crack at that because one of our, as I said, we have 14 coalition member organizations, of course, including CHCI and Unidos US and LULAC and many others. But one of them is ACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. This is the national organization that represents all of our Hispanic serving institutions. I know that whenever I go to corporate America, let's say I'm having a hard time finding Latino engineers. I said, have you visited the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez? Have you visited other schools that have strong engineering programs? The reality is that when corporate America begins to become more intentional, saying we're going to go to Hispanic serving institutions and we're going to find the talent there, instead of going to your work colleagues and saying, who do you know at your alma mater at Harvard or Wharton or UPenn or anywhere else, and especially if they're not diverse and you're asking them for referrals. This is something that needs to happen. But I'll talk really briefly about the referral process, because this is something that also needs to change. You can have 10,000 diversity-focused recruiters, but 10,000 diversity-focused recruiters cannot compete with 200,000 employees who may not be diverse and are using the referral process to refer their non-diverse candidates into the school, into the workplace. So everybody, every single employee must be part of a diversity-focused initiative to bring more Latinos into their companies, and then together we can move the needle much faster. But it starts with recognizing that we have highly qualified Latinos graduating from our Hispanic serving institutions. And even if it's not a four-year college, our nation's community colleges, which are making a significant impact in workforce development. but there must be that intentionality. The Harvard and Whartons, don't worry, they'll be fine. But we need to look for those talents like me. I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I'm a proud graduate of The Ohio State University. Go Buckeyes! And the fact is that this Ohio State Buckeye became the #1 ranked Wall Street analyst in the world and the first Afro-Latino CEO of any national Hispanic organization. So that's what we can do, but it requires that intentionality.
And building off of what Sid said, and also what Chris mentioned the infrastructure and that sometimes that infrastructure doesn't exist. I think also it's looking at your employees, and if you find the Sid Wilson in the mailroom or others that are, have really good work ethic and you just see a lot of promise in them, help them go to business school, help them open that door for them. Because I know a lot of companies have partnerships with business schools in their communities. And I think that's another avenue where you have to think outside the box. If the numbers are not there going the way that you've been going, then think, how can you do something differently?
Chris, would you like to add anything else to that question?
No, I completely agree. I think looking for pipelines is difficult, and I won't claim that it's easy, but a priority for corporate America and for the government sector.
Do we have any other questions in the chat? Let me see. Well, somebody says they love Michigan. I don't know if that's a direct message for you, Sid.
It was. I love my Michigan friends, just not with Ohio State.
Let me see. They're sending some private messages. Attacks on Latinos, and what can corporations do? I don't know if Patricia, Sid, or Chris wanna just quickly. We only have a couple of minutes. Kind of contextualize everything that is happening to our community, and what can corporations do in the context of those attacks.
I'll be quick with that. Maybe Patricia might want to say this. And this is an important question because we didn't have time to really go deep into this. Is that when an attack on one of our community brothers and sisters is an attack on all of us. What's happened in the Black community with the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, was an attack on our Latino community. Because remember, it was a year ago that someone went to El Paso, Texas, strictly to target Mexican Americans to shoot to kill. And it was 4 years ago when we had the tragic situation at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. And when we look at what's happened, of course, even with our Jewish brothers and sisters, with the Tree of Light Synagogue and the increased amount of anti-Semitism, that means that when the Black community is saying Black Lives Matters, we must all rise up and say Black Lives Matters. When our Latinos are attacked, and we have to come, all of us must rise up together and say, si se puede, regardless of whether you're Latino or not. In other words, we must stand together. This is not a time to say, what about me? This is about how can I be a strong collaborator? Because that way, when something happens to our community, then we can make sure we have our allies and accomplices ready to stand and march with us, as we must march with our Black brothers and sisters, with our Asian brothers and sisters who are unfortunately under attack because of this stereotype that that if you're Asian American, you were involved with all these things, like coronavirus. That's why I stood with our Asian brothers and sisters in condemning that kind of racism. So in other words, all of these things need to come to an end, but it's going to require us to be able to come together and collaborate, because together we are stronger.
On my behalf, I just want to say thank you to Invariant for inviting us. I know how long it took to put this together. To my good friend Nicole over there at Invariant, thank you, amiga, for your friendship and also for reaching out. And I pass it out to our friends over there at Invariant.
Thank you, Hector. Yes, we have come to the end of the 5th panel discussion of Invariant's Dialogue for Change. Thank you to our speakers, Hector Sanchez, Claudia Romo Edelman, Patricia Tamez, and Sid Wilson. Our next Dialogue for Change will be on October 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's going to feature prominent activists on the front lines who are going to discuss their expectations for corporate participation in the social justice movement. Please look out for follow-up emails from Invariant on more details about our Dialogue for Change speaker series and for additional anti-racism resources. You can also find us on Twitter at @Invariant and on LinkedIn. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Invariant. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you, Hector. And thank you to all of our colleagues. And thank you, Chris, for your leadership as well.